In 2019, a Chicago archivist made a discovery that would change everything. What should have been routine, scanning a forgotten photograph from 1901, became something else entirely when modern technology revealed what the naked eye had missed for over a century. 3 children, perfect smiles, Sunday best clothes, a moment of innocence captured in silver and light. But high-resolution scanning doesn't lie. The marks around their necks told a different story. Their glassy, vacant eyes, their unnaturally rigid poses. These children weren't posing for a portrait. They had already passed away. One photograph, dozens of missing children, a century of buried truth. And somewhere in Chicago, a sealed room that hasn't been opened since 1922. The year 2019 had been unremarkable for Dr. Eleanor Price, a senior archivist at the Chicago City Archives, until one quiet September morning altered the course of her life and the legacy of one of the city's most revered institutions. A lifelong historian with a PhD in archival studies and 2 decades of experience in photographic preservation, Eleanor was known for her meticulous standards and calm demeanor, the kind of professional who spent more time surrounded by boxes of fragile negatives than with people. That Tuesday began like most others. She arrived early, brewed the strong black tea she preferred over coffee, and slipped into her workroom lined with temperature-controlled filing cabinets and UV-filtered lighting. On her task list for the day was digitizing a newly donated collection from the estate of Veronica Langford, a prominent Chicago socialite whose family had reportedly supported several local orphanages during the early 1900s. Among the collection were silver gelatin prints, stereographs, daguerreotypes, a treasure trove for historians. As Eleanor began scanning them, she was struck by the pristine condition of one particular 8x10 matte photograph tucked in a manila folder labeled Langford Orphanage Support, 1901. The image appeared simple at first glance. 3 children standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a painted studio backdrop. 2 boys, one around 12, the other perhaps 8, wore identical dark suits with white collars, their shoes polished to a shine. Between them stood a girl in a white lace dress, about 10, her hair neatly curled and a ribbon perched delicately atop her head. All 3 children faced the camera with expressions that seemed oddly serene. Too perfectly composed, Eleanor thought, for a studio photo from the turn of the century. What truly caught her attention, however, was the handwritten inscription on the back: James, Abigail, and Peter Lyle. Rosehill Home for Children. December 15th, 1901. Eleanor paused. Rosehill Home. The name triggered something, not a memory, but a professional instinct. She typed it into the City Archives internal database and confirmed that Rosehill had been one of Chicago's most well-regarded orphanages, in operation from 1885 until its closure in 1922. Founded by Sister Agnes Delaney, the facility had been featured in newspapers of the era for its progressive child-rearing practices and moral development through silence and obedience. Eleanor had read the headlines, seen the praise, even filed pamphlets from the orphanage herself. Yet something about this image unsettled her, like a door opening in the back of her mind. Still unsure what exactly had raised her concern, Eleanor decided to scan the photograph using the newly installed 12K archival scanner the department had acquired only 2 months earlier, a machine capable of capturing microscopic detail once invisible to the naked eye. As the scanner's light passed over the print, Eleanor zoomed in on the preview screen, curious to examine the fabric texture of the girl's lace dress and a small brass plaque visible behind them in the background, partially obscured by the studio curtain. As the ultra-high-resolution scan rendered pixel by pixel, Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. Around each child's neck, nearly imperceptible in the original, appeared faint, darkened lines, thin but distinct, like shadows or markings that shouldn't have been there. At first, she considered the possibility of old photographic artifacts, maybe chemical damage, maybe light exposure from decades of storage. But as she adjusted the contrast and brightness, the markings became more pronounced, forming perfect circles just beneath the children's collarbones. Her breath caught in her throat. She magnified the image further, studying each face with growing unease. The children's composed expressions remained intact, but their eyes began to tell a different story. They appeared strangely vacant, with an unnatural glassy quality that professional photographers of that era would have retaken. There was something deeply wrong with the lighting on their faces, subtle inconsistencies that her trained eye couldn't ignore. Eleanor stood up, stepping back from the monitor, suddenly hyper-aware of how cold the room felt despite the climate controls. She reviewed the raw scan again, now searching for signs that would disprove her growing suspicions. Movement blur, retouching artifacts, anything to suggest this was simply an unfortunate photographic accident or deterioration. But the scanner had done its job too well. What she saw wasn't a trick of light or aging emulsion. The realization hit her like a physical blow. These children weren't posing for a celebratory photograph. Something terrible had happened to them, and someone had carefully staged this image to hide the truth. Eleanor knocked over her tea, the cup shattering on the linoleum floor, but she didn't clean it up. Her hand shaking, she printed a hard copy of the scan, highlighted the suspicious markings, and sent an urgent message to the department head, attaching the file and requesting an immediate consultation. She also flagged the original print for evidence custody and locked it in a climate-controlled case, labeling it as sensitive historical material requiring further investigation. As the door clicked shut on the storage vault, she stood alone in the quiet hum of the archive room, staring at the thumbnail of the photograph on her screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but there were no words she could type that would fully explain the horror of what she had discovered. All she knew was that this image, this one single photograph, had revealed a dark secret that had been hidden for over a century. In her professional career, Eleanor had uncovered countless historical mysteries, but none had ever made her feel so deeply unsettled. This wasn't just a discovery about the past. It was evidence of something that demanded justice, even after all these years. And she had a terrible feeling that once she opened this door, there would be no closing it again. The Rosehill Home for children had harbored secrets far darker than anyone had imagined, and Eleanor Price had just become the keeper of its most damning evidence. The following morning, Dr. Eleanor Price arrived at the archive an hour before opening. The image of the Lyle children haunting her dreams, their empty smiles looping in her mind like a broken reel of film. She hadn't told anyone outside the archive team, not yet, but the urgency in her tone had been enough to summon her supervisor, Gregory Shaw, a cautious but open-minded historian who'd spent his career avoiding speculation and preferring facts. Shaw stared at the enhanced photograph in silence for over a minute, adjusting his glasses, as if the distortion were on his lenses and not in the picture itself. "They look alive," he muttered, then leaned in closer. "But those marks..." Eleanor said nothing, just zoomed further. The ligature patterns were now unmistakable, dark abrasions circling each child's neck with subtle indentations, more visible now that she'd used gradient mapping to bring out mid-tone detail. Shaw exhaled slowly. "We need someone who can confirm this isn't just artifact damage," he said finally. "This is above our pay grade." Within 24 hours, the image was securely transmitted to Dr. Olivia Sung, a forensic analyst affiliated with Northwestern University's Department of Pathology, specializing in fatality verification through image analysis. A calm and sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, Sung responded with professional curiosity and scheduled an in-person review the following day. She arrived with her own equipment, a calibrated medical-grade monitor and proprietary enhancement software used in criminal investigations, and requested to examine both the original scan and the photograph itself. The moment she laid eyes on the high-resolution image, she grew quiet. "This isn't a coincidence," she said, marking the areas around each child's eyes and mouth. "The discoloration follows consistent vascular patterns. If this were an accident or poor photographic preservation, the damage would be irregular. This is pattern trauma." She zoomed in on the older boy, James. "There's evidence here, here, and here, classic markers of manual pressure." She then pointed to the girl's fingers, noting the coloration. "See the lividity? That's blood pooling post-mortem. And the stiffness in the hand? That's early rigor." Shaw shifted uncomfortably, while Eleanor sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This was staged," Sung added. "These children were posed to look alive, but they're not. I'd bet my credentials on it." She asked if there were any historical specialists available for photographic analysis, and Eleanor contacted Dr. Henry Alcott, a respected professor of photographic history from the Art Institute of Chicago. Alcott, a fastidious man with a fondness for antique lenses, joined them later that week. His expertise lay in photographic technique, exposure times, development methods, and studio setups of the early 20th century. When he examined the Lyle portrait, his analysis focused not on the children, but on the photograph's composition. "Look at the symmetry," he said, pointing to the way the children's bodies were aligned. "Perfectly still. Too still." Children of that age, particularly younger boys, would struggle to maintain posture over long exposure times, but here, there's no movement blur. None at all. He pulled up a sample from a 1900 Sears catalog. "Now compare this. See the slight haloing here, on the edges of the clothing? That's a living subject moving slightly during exposure. But your image has no such distortions." Then he pointed to a small studio clamp visible behind Peter's shoe, partially hidden beneath a prop rug. That clamp was used to hold adults in place for portraits. "You'd never use that for children unless..." He didn't finish the sentence. Alcott also pointed out that the shadows beneath the children were oddly crisp, consistent with subjects held in place, not standing of their own volition. The backdrop, too, had been hung higher than usual, likely to disguise the support stands. With both forensic and photographic evidence aligned, the archive team was now faced with a horrifying probability. The Lyle children had already passed away when they were photographed. Eleanor's heart pounded as she retrieved the manila folder once again and studied the handwritten inscription, "Rosehill Home for Children." December 15th, 1901. It wasn't just an orphanage anymore. It was now a potential crime scene, albeit one buried under decades of concrete and history. She requested access to the original donation files from Veronica Langford's estate and confirmed that the photograph had been kept in a cedar box marked Christmas fundraiser, Rosehill, implying it may have been sent to patrons as part of a donor campaign. A shiver ran through her. Had these post-mortem portraits been distributed as promotional materials? Olivia Sung returned with additional enhancements, overlaying infrared scans to reveal subdermal discoloration on the older boy's temple and the beginnings of livor mortis on the girl's left wrist. "These aren't natural passings," she said flatly. "These are suspicious circumstances, and this photo was used for presentation, possibly even concealment." Shaw, usually averse to melodrama, agreed to escalate the matter. The team reached out to the Chicago Historical Crimes Division, requesting an official review under the city's dormant cold case policy, citing potential evidence of historical wrongful actions. The request was flagged due to the photograph's age and the unusual nature of the forensic evidence, but after internal review, Detectives Carmen Ruiz and Ethan Morales were assigned to assess the case. They arrived at the archive 2 weeks later, skeptical at first, until they saw the scans. Ruiz, who had worked on multiple child endangerment cases, paled. "I've seen this before," she said. "The poses, the placement of hands, it's too perfect. It's what you do when you're trying to pretend nothing happened." Morales said nothing for a long time, just stared at the photo as if trying to find life in the children's eyes. "If this photo is real," he finally said, "then we just stumbled into something Chicago was never meant to remember." Eleanor felt the shift in the room, a weight settling in, as if the children in the photograph had finally been heard after over a century of silence. What had begun as a routine digitization project had now become an official criminal investigation. The photograph, once filed as a historical keepsake, had transformed into a silent witness, a century-old scream frozen in silver and cellulose, demanding justice. And as the detectives left with the original print sealed in evidence-grade packaging, Eleanor stood alone again in the archive, the scan still glowing softly on her monitor. She didn't look away. Detectives Carmen Ruiz and Ethan Morales had seen their share of strange cases over the years. Old crime scenes reopened by family discoveries, confessions from aging witnesses, long-lost evidence surfacing from estate clearances, but never a criminal investigation launched by a photograph more than a century old. Still, the Lau photo unsettled them in a way few active cases had. There was something deeply disturbing about the composition. Children posed in an unnatural manner, presented with ribbons and polish for a camera in circumstances that seemed deliberately deceptive. After reviewing the comprehensive forensic and photographic findings, Ruiz proposed a cold case inquiry under Chicago's historical crimes statute, a seldom-used protocol that allowed re-examination of potentially criminal acts from the city's early institutional records, especially in cases involving suspected misconduct or cover-ups. The formal request was approved by the department, and within several days, the detectives were methodically combing through the extensive archive documentation of the Rosehill Home for children. Founded in 1885, Rosehill had operated for nearly 4 decades, consistently praised in local newspapers for its firm but loving Christian discipline, and its dedicated director, Sister Agnes Delaney, who was regularly celebrated in period publications as Chicago's Mother of the Orphaned. But as Ruiz and Morales carefully peeled back the meticulously preserved surface of Rosehill's glowing public image, they began to discover troubling inconsistencies and discrepancies buried deep within the institutional paper trail. The first significant red flag appeared in the form of official documentation, or rather, the conspicuous lack thereof. While Rosehill's internal records claim that over 120 children had been transferred from their care between 1885 and 1922, official city transfer records only accounted for 41 documented cases. The remaining 79 names were listed exclusively in Rosehill's own handwritten institutional ledger, often citing vague or suspiciously identical explanations like family relocation, private placement, or medical transfer. Growing suspicious, Morales requested verification copies of those transfer documents from the Illinois Department of Child Services. Days later, he received troubling confirmation. Only 47 of the 120 recorded transfers had been filed through proper official channels. "That's not clerical error," Ruiz said. carefully thumbing through the inconsistent files. That's deliberate falsification. They tracked down placement records next, focusing specifically on the children whose paperwork claimed successful adoption through Westbridge Family Services, a small placement agency once located on the city's outskirts. When they visited the agency's former location, now a vacant lot beside a modern warehouse park, they discovered that most institutional records had been lost to time, but the inherited administrative files were still intact. There was no mention of any Rosehill placements through Westbridge Services during the relevant time period. If these children weren't placed here, Morales asked with growing concern, where did they actually go? That crucial question led them back to a name they had seen repeated throughout the orphanage's internal medical logs. Dr. Malcolm Greaves, the listed attending physician for every child's health entry between 1900 and 1903, including James, Abigail, and Peter Lyle. But Greaves, it seemed, was essentially a phantom. There were no official records of a Dr. Malcolm Greaves ever holding a valid medical license in the state of Illinois. His name did not appear in the city's comprehensive medical directories from that era, nor was there any academic or professional trace of him in nationwide professional databases. It was as if the man had been invented solely for Rosehill's administrative paperwork. Ruiz reached out to a professional genealogist with the state's historical society to investigate deeper, and the results only intensified the growing mystery. There were no Greaves listed in any Chicago census during that time period matching the age, profession, or profile of a practicing physician. We're chasing a complete fabrication, Ruiz muttered with frustration, or someone who desperately wanted to remain invisible. They shifted their investigative focus and began systematically interviewing descendants of those connected to Rosehill's operations. One promising lead came from a woman named Helen Armitage, great-granddaughter of a former cook who'd worked at Rosehill until 1904. Helen recalled disturbing stories her great-grandmother used to tell, whispered accounts of the doctor with black gloves, who worked exclusively at night and never spoke directly to the children unless something was seriously wrong with their health. She said he had an unusually quiet voice, Helen told them during the interview, and unnaturally cold hands. The children were genuinely terrified whenever he appeared. From this valuable lead, they uncovered a faded employee photograph in an old newspaper archive, a formal portrait taken in 1902 of Rosehill's complete staff standing in front of the main institutional building. In the back row, positioned directly behind Sister Delaney, was a tall, thin man wearing dark gloves, his face turned ever so slightly away from the camera. He was labeled simply Dr. M. Greaves. The image was frustratingly grainy, but Ruiz enlarged it digitally and noted something distinctly odd. The doctor's expression was not blank or neutral, but tight and deliberately controlled, like a mask being carefully held in place. He knew exactly what he was doing, she said quietly with conviction. As they systematically cross-referenced hospital employment rosters from surrounding counties, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. A man matching Greaves' general description had worked under various suspicious aliases at several state-run institutions between 1894 and 1900, each time leaving his position abruptly after incidents involving inappropriate conduct or highly unorthodox medical treatments. His last known documented appearance was at Springfield State Hospital, where he was immediately terminated after an anonymous complaint alleged serious professional misconduct and dangerous treatment methods. But the official paper trail went completely cold after 1900, and from that point forward, Dr. Greaves only existed within Rosehill's closed institutional system. Meanwhile, Ruiz uncovered concerning internal reports from the Department of Children's Welfare dating back to 1903 that raised serious questions about Rosehill's unusually high transfer rate, particularly among children labeled as unfit for standard placement or emotionally challenging. These outdated terms, Ruiz recognized, aligned closely with what modern social services would classify as children with developmental disabilities or behavioral challenges. Rosehill had consistently received substantial city funding based on the total number of children it housed and successfully placed into adoptive homes, which made their irregular transfer patterns all the more suspicious. Fewer children to care for, same government money coming in, Morales said grimly. They were systematically reducing their responsibilities. One final revelation came from Eleanor Price, who had continued researching the Lau family background during the ongoing investigation. She discovered that the 3 children had been admitted to Rosehill 2 months before the mysterious photograph was taken, after their parents had tragically perished in a devastating Southside boarding house fire. With no extended family members available, they were officially placed in Rosehill as legal wards of the city. The orphanage's own internal files claimed the 3 children had been successfully transferred to a rural family within 3 weeks of their arrival. The timing, however, didn't align with other evidence. Chicago's placement records showed no rural family adoptions during that specific period. City administrative files revealed no corresponding transfer documentation. There's no official trail, Eleanor said with growing alarm. There's no verifiable evidence. Just a carefully staged photograph of 3 smiling children and a fabricated doctor's signature beneath their falsified records. With each disturbing fact uncovered, Ruiz and Morales felt the weight of something much larger than simple administrative fraud or falsified documentation. They were not dealing with isolated incidents of misconduct, but rather a long-standing institutional system of deliberate deception. Children selected for reasons unknown, removed from official records and public memory under the protective veil of institutional respectability and community trust. The Rosehill Home, once proudly lauded in newspaper headlines and fondly remembered by elderly community patrons, now loomed ominously in the detectives' minds as a house of carefully guarded secrets, built not for genuine care, but for systematic concealment. And somewhere beneath the concrete foundations and recently repainted floors of what was now a modern condominium complex, they both strongly suspected the complete truth still waited patiently to be unearthed. It was a cold Thursday morning in early November when detectives Carmen Ruiz and Ethan Morales received permission to search the lower levels of the former Rosehill Home for children, now repurposed into high-end condominiums under the name the Delaney Residences, a bitter nod to the woman they now believed had helped conceal decades of unspeakable crimes. The building superintendent, an affable man named Mike Jarrett, was cooperative but skeptical. He had lived on the property for 10 years and claimed he'd never seen or heard anything unusual. "We got wine cellars down there now," he said, leading them past private elevators and storage cages in the basement. Old boiler room sealed shut, though. No one's touched it since the renovation. That comment caught Ruiz's attention. She requested access to the original blueprints from the Department of Buildings, and sure enough, the plans from 1899 revealed a room that no longer existed on the modern floor plans, a 14 by 18-foot space labeled simply as records and processing. It should have been located behind the southern wall of the old boiler room. With permission from the condo board, Jarrett helped them pry open a rusted maintenance panel. Behind it, obscured by drywall and forgotten insulation, was the edge of a corroded metal door, bolted shut from the outside with antique hardware. The detectives forced it open with industrial crowbars, and the thick smell of time, Old paper, decay, and iron hit them like a physical blow. Their flashlight beam sliced through the dust, revealing a narrow passage lined with crumbling brick and rotted wood beams. At the end of it stood the door to a small, windowless chamber that had gone untouched for nearly 100 years. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. A single overhead chain pull light flickered to life, revealing what could only be described as a shrine to those who had passed away. In the center of the room sat a heavy, dented metal trunk sealed with 2 brass latches. Along the walls, wooden shelving units held stacks of brittle folders, old photography equipment, and yellowed paper wrapped in wax cloth. Ruiz opened the trunk first. Inside, laid in perfectly spaced rows, were dozens of black and white photographs, each mounted on thick cardstock and labeled in pencil with names and dates. The images were nearly identical in composition. Children, some very young, seated or standing against studio backdrops, their hands folded neatly, eyes fixed open and vacant. At first glance, they looked like quaint family portraits from a bygone era. But when held to the light, the truth was unmistakable. Every single child bore unmistakable signs of postmortem posing. One girl had ligature marks beneath a satin collar. A boy's wrist was misshapen where rigor had set in. Another child's head slumped just slightly to one side, supported by a wire stand visible in the shadow. In all, there were 63 photographs, each child captured with the same sterile care. Ruiz struggled to maintain composure while Morales knelt silently, counting the names aloud. Each name matched those from the orphanage's falsified records. "These are memorials," he whispered. "They're documentation." But perhaps the most damning item was found tucked beneath the photographs. A leather-bound journal, cracked and flaking at the edges, with pages numbered by hand and entries written in meticulous cursive. The cover was embossed with the initials MG, Malcolm Greaves, or whoever he truly was. The first entry was dated September 7th, 1900, and the content erased all lingering doubt. Initial intake for children, 2 suitable for rehoming, 1 mute unresponsive, 1 unstable, aggressive during chapel. Recommend removal within the week. Must not disrupt harmony among the rest. Page after page chronicled a grim bureaucracy of elimination, behavioral notes, disciplinary decisions, dates of disposal. The writer referred to the children by case number, rarely by name, and his tone was clinical, detached, almost proud. October 22nd, C. 19 resisted sleep medication. Implemented soft ligature during prayer hour. Sister Delaney approves of this method, prefers no visible evidence. The entries continued, each more disturbing than the last. The children were described as disobedient, unadoptable, excess inventory. Their passing was not seen as tragedy, but as course correction. December 15th, 1901, Lao Trio terminated following sustained defiance. Noted prolonged resistance in male subject. Photograph post-event. Placement successful, smiles achieved. The entry aligned with the date on the photograph Eleanor had discovered. It wasn't just a random coincidence. The image that had haunted her for weeks was now confirmed as evidence of deliberate harm, planned and executed by the very people entrusted with protecting the city's most vulnerable children. At the back of the journal, they found a folded floor plan with a red X marked beneath what had once been the orphanage's east wing, labeled Lime Disposal. Morales circled it with his pen. "We need to excavate," he said. The journal continued with entries into 1903, growing darker and more erratic. The writer began speaking of moral purification, of how some children were beyond saving and a burden to divine order. He referenced Sister Delaney frequently, describing her as a willing participant who trusted him to cleanse the weak from the flock. One entry from March 1902 read, "Sister has requested resolution of M. 7 before visitors arrive. Persistent coughing during Vespers. She fears it reflects poorly on the home." Ruiz closed the journal with shaking hands. This was no longer theory. It was no longer even a cold case. This was systematic elimination, religiously justified, institutionally protected, and visually documented for over 3 years. They sealed the room as a crime scene and began cataloging every item. The trunk was sent for forensic analysis. DNA swabs were taken from the photograph backs, the journal, and the gloves found tucked in the bottom of the trunk, stiff with age, but possibly still bearing skin cells. The news of the discovery was shared only with the chief of detectives and the mayor's office, who ordered strict confidentiality until the evidence could be verified and families identified. Eleanor Price, upon seeing the journal herself, quietly wept. "They wanted to be remembered," she said, "even if only by the wrong people. But now their faces, once used to disguise the truth, were finally being seen for what they were. Not smiles, but screams posed into silence. And the room that had concealed them for over a century had now become their first real chance at justice." The basement conference room of the Historical Crimes Division was silent, except for the faint hum of the evidence dehumidifier. Detective Carmen Ruiz sat at the head of the table, gloved hands resting on the latest arrival from Dr. Olivia Sung, a slim manila envelope marked for immediate review. When she split it open, the first item she pulled free was a photocopy of a personnel card from the Elgin State Hospital, dated 1897. The photograph stared back at her, a thin, sharp-featured man with pale eyes and a mouth that pressed into a flat, unreadable line. Underneath, in faded type, Martin Gabriel, staff physician. Dr. Sung's handwriting in the margin was blunt. Handwriting match. 97.4% MG Journal. 3 days earlier, Sung had called with a tremor in her normally calm voice. She'd been combing through employment rosters from state mental institutions, cross-checking them against the looping script in the Rosehill Journal. Elgin's archive had provided the hit, a perfect match on the signature, and a record of dismissal for improper conduct with patients and alteration of official records. The paper trail went cold after 1899, but for those 2 years, Gabriel had been employed in the same quiet, deliberate way Dr. Malcolm Greaves had appeared at Rosehill. Morales leaned over her shoulder, scanning the notes. No birth record, no university enrollment, no medical licensing. "He's a ghost. A ghost with a pattern," Ruiz murmured. "Institution to institution, always leaving under a cloud, and always with access to people no one would question him about." The next file Sung had enclosed was worse. A sealed complaint from 3 Elgin nurses, written in careful, looping script, accused Gabriel of carrying out procedures that had never been authorized. The charges had been buried when he resigned, no doubt under quiet pressure from the hospital board. The language in the nurse's account echoed Rosehill's own cold terminology: beyond help, peaceful resolutions, no further disturbance to the ward. It was a lead that might have stood alone, until Ruiz turned her attention to Sister Agnes Delaney. In the quiet hum of the Archdiocese archives, she worked through boxes of brittle correspondence, her gloves dusted with the fine powder of aging paper. Sister Agnes's public image had been spotless, a tireless benefactor, a celebrated figure in Chicago's Catholic community, even honored with a scholarship fund in her name. Yet here, In file after file, Ruiz found the theme. A letter from 1901, written by a concerned parishioner, described Sister Agnes as unusually harsh with the children and averse to placing those of difficult temperament. Another, from a wealthy patron, quoted her directly, "Some are better suited to the order of institutional care than the disorder of family life." Most damning were the documents that followed. Transfer forms bearing Sister Agnes's unmistakable handwriting, listing children as placed into homes that never existed. Several bore the initials MG in the physician's signature field. In a set of private letters archived in a Milwaukee convent, Ruiz found the mask slipping further. One, dated November 1901, chilled her more than any case file. Asterisk, the doctor has such a blessed way of bringing peace to the troubled ones. The quiet that settles over our halls afterward is truly divine. I sleep better knowing the disruptive influences have been removed from our sacred mission. Asterisk. Ruiz read the line twice, feeling the temperature in the room drop. The final blow came in the lab report from the hidden archive. DNA recovered from hair strands inside the trunk matched descendants of families whose children had been transferred out of Rosehill but never seen again. Handwriting analysts confirmed that Greaves, or Gabriel, and Sister Agnes had worked side by side on falsified documents. Chemical residue on the photographs suggested they'd been developed in the hidden room itself. At the bottom of the trunk, beneath the photographs and the journal, were the small things that didn't belong in any ledger. A frayed ribbon, a wooden spinning top, an unfinished letter to Dear Mama. Each bore a case number that corresponded to an entry in the journal. When Ruiz lifted one photograph from the pile, she froze. It was the Lyle children again, James, Abigail, and Peter, their eyes glassy under the studio light, their hands folded just so. The neat case number in the corner matched the December 15th entry. Lyle trio removed following sustained defiance, smiles, achieved. The words blurred on the page, but Ruiz didn't look away. The children who had begun this investigation, who had drawn them into a century-old conspiracy, were now confirmed victims. Their lives ended under the dual authority of a false doctor and a revered nun. By the time Ruiz finished compiling her final report, the pattern was undeniable. Martin Gabriel, alias Malcolm Greaves, had used his fabricated medical authority to identify and remove unfit children under the guise of treatment. Sister Agnes had let her religious standing to shield him, selecting targets and crafting the paperwork to make them vanish without trace. Together, they had refined a system of elimination so efficient that it had gone unnoticed for over a century, hidden beneath institutional prestige and public trust. As Ruiz signed the report, she glanced again at the Lyle photograph propped on the desk. The glassy eye seemed to look past her, into some place far beyond the reach of courts or juries. It was over on paper, but the silence that had protected them for 120 years still clung to the air, and breaking it would demand more than a signature. 3 days later, excavation crews would break ground beneath the east wing of the Delaney residences. The names from Ruiz's report would be read aloud for the first time since they were written, not in a ledger, but in the open air. And the city would finally learn what had been buried in both soil and memory. The news emerged quietly at first. A brief segment featured in the late-night local broadcast, a caption beneath the anchor's voice, historical evidence discovered at former Chicago institution. But within days, the story spread like wildfire, picked up by national outlets, then international, as the remarkable details unfolded. The photographs, the journal, the concealed room beneath the floor. The fact that one of Chicago's most celebrated historical figures, Sister Agnes Delaney, had been posthumously revealed as a central figure in one of the most significant institutional mysteries in American history. Public interest surged, especially as archaeological investigation confirmed what researchers had suspected. The underground chamber marked in Martin Gable's floor plan was real. Located beneath what was now a private fitness center in the condominium's East Wing, the space had been sealed during renovations in the 1980s. With ground-penetrating radar and a week of careful excavation, the team revealed a concealed area containing historical artifacts, personal belongings, and evidence that would rewrite decades of accepted historical understanding. The discovery included items belonging to 43 individuals, ranging in age from approximately 3 to 14 years old. Forensic analysis began immediately, spearheaded by a collaboration between the Chicago Historical Society and the Illinois Institute of Archaeological Research. Of the 43 cases, 31 were eventually documented through genealogical research and careful analysis of archived municipal records. Among them were James, Abigail, and Peter Lyle, the young people whose photograph had initiated the entire investigation. Their identification brought Eleanor Price to tears, not just because she had initiated the investigation, but because their image had stayed with her through every step, their expressions etched into her mind like a permanent reminder. "I always wondered if they knew someone would eventually find them," she said during a press interview. Perhaps that photograph was preserved for this very purpose. The city moved quickly to address the revelations. A memorial task force was formed, and Lincoln Park, one of Chicago's oldest public green spaces, was selected as the site for a permanent monument honoring those who had been overlooked by documented history. In a public ceremony held in May 2021, hundreds of Chicago residents gathered under overcast skies as the names of the 31 identified individuals were read aloud, each name echoing through the trees, breaking the silence that had concealed them for more than a century. A black granite monument, shaped like an open book, was unveiled that day. On one page, the names of those who had been lost to historical record. On the other, a message etched in steel. For the young lives who were never heard, we now speak. For the lives forgotten, we now remember. Beneath the monument, a time capsule was placed, containing the Lyle photograph, copies of the journal, and letters from Chicago school students written to honor those who came before them, ensuring they would not be overlooked again. But the impact of the case extended far beyond the city limits. Archivists, museums, and historical societies across the country began re-evaluating their collections, particularly photographs and documents from orphanages, asylums, and other historical institutions. The American Association of Archivists issued new standards requiring comprehensive digital review of all historical youth portraits taken between 1880 and 1920, with specialized training to identify previously overlooked details and inconsistencies in historical documentation. Several other cities launched investigations into facilities with unusual historical records, revealing smaller but similarly significant discoveries in places like Philadelphia, Boston, and St. Louis. In one particularly notable case in Ohio, a historian revealed an entire collection of unusual portraits that had been misunderstood for decades. What had once been viewed as simple historical mementos were now recognized as carefully constructed records with deeper historical significance. The Rosehill case transformed how historical research was conducted, not just in textbooks, but in archives, in research laboratories, in academic institutions. It reshaped the way historical figures are remembered, especially those long praised for their charitable work. Public understanding of historical institutions, particularly those with limited documentation, came under renewed scholarly scrutiny. Monuments were reconsidered. Names were removed from buildings. Historical narratives were rewritten with greater nuance and critical examination. But amid the larger cultural reevaluation, it was the individual stories, the names, the faces, the quiet, undocumented lives that resonated most deeply with the public. For Eleanor, the aftermath brought mixed emotions of professional satisfaction and personal reflection. She was promoted to Director of Special Collections and invited to speak internationally about the case, but she found herself declining most opportunities for public speaking. This wasn't a career achievement, she said during her final public statement. It was a mission to restore dignity to overlooked lives. We didn't change their circumstances, but we ensured their stories were finally told and their existence acknowledged in the historical record. Carmen Ruiz and Ethan Morales continued working in the Historical Mysteries Division, now permanently funded as part of a federal initiative to investigate long-term institutional mysteries in government-funded facilities. They each kept a copy of the Lyle photograph in their workspace, not the digitally enhanced version that revealed additional details, but the original scan, unaltered and authentic. It's important to remember how the world saw them originally, Morales explained, before we understood the complete story behind the historical evidence. The Delaney residences were eventually renamed Violet House, in honor of Violet Camden, one of the youngest individuals whose story had been recovered through the investigation. A memorial plaque was installed in the lobby and a framed reproduction of her photograph, once stored away in archives, now hung prominently on the wall beside it, her name clearly displayed underneath for all to see. Visitors often paused to look at her image. Some lingered, reading the accompanying historical context. Others moved on quickly, but carried the story with them. No one could say they hadn't been made aware of her existence and her place in the building's documented history. In classrooms across Chicago, the Rosehill case was incorporated into school history curricula under the category of recovered histories, where students were encouraged not only to learn from documented events, but to think critically about historical narratives, to ask what other stories might exist beneath the official record, waiting to be discovered and understood through proper research methods. The story of the Lyle family, and the dozens of others like them, became woven into the city's collective consciousness, quiet, persistent, and meaningful. A reminder that historical truth can be complex and multifaceted, that important stories can remain concealed for generations, that once revealed, historical evidence can still reshape our understanding of the past and inform our approach to future research. And that even in the most overlooked corners of historical archives, there may still be one more photograph waiting to reveal its secrets, one more story ready to emerge from the shadows of forgotten documentation into the light of historical truth and remembrance.